the way I carry it, that we think that any type of advice that my fellow believer gives me is a knock on my character, and I can't stand that. Other times, I think I know so much that I can give my opinion about anything and anyone. This is the day and age of social media, of Twitter, where everyone gives their opinion about whatever topic there is. Whether they're an expert, whether they've even read a few things, a few articles about that topic or not. If I read a single article about a topic, I become an expert. So much so that I'm willing to share my opinion on that topic with other people. It becomes to such a point that I close myself off to the guidance that Allah sets in place in His creation and through His creation. I might not be deaf. I might still have ears to hear, but then I close my ears off to that hidayah. I might not be blind, but I close my eyes off to the truth. Now, Allah responds to the way that I live, and to my character and my disposition. There is a very beautiful, but also very sort of startling hadith of our first Imam, Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam. It's a hikmah, one of those wise words of the Imam that is found in the last section of Nahjul Balagha. It is said that one day, Amirul Mu'mineen Imam Ali took the hand of his companion Kumail, and he brought him into the desert. Took him far away from the city of Kufa. And it is said that Amirul Mu'mineen, when he saw that there was no one else around who could listen, he begins. And he gives this very famous hadith. It begins in this way: Ya Kumail, inna hadhihi al-qulub aw'iyatun, fa khayruha aw'aha. These hearts are vessels, and the best of them is that which contains that which is within them, the best. That which preserves and does not let loose that which it contains. فَاحْفَظْ عَنِّي مَا, that which I tell you. And then the Imam, he فَعَابَنِي, either there is a godly and divine, and then amajun ra'a, you are like gnats, and you follow whatever call comes to you. Yaminuna ma'a kulli riih. And whenever a wind comes and blows these gnats, they move to the left, and then they move heard of. He says, Ha inna hahuna la ilman jamma. When we talk about closing ourselves off to learning, to being guided by the creation of Allah back unto Allah, to having my own opinion, and that is the end of the discussion, to giving my opinion to others as though it is revelation itself, the Imam says, he responds that sometimes when you have this disposition, then sometimes God treats you with silence. And the Imam, when he sees that there is no one who is willing to listen, then the Imam responds with silence. Sometimes we experience this in our own lives. When our children, they don't listen to us. They do whatever they want. At some point, our children become teenagers, and then they think that they can live their own life and they don't need the guidance or the teaching that their parents give them. At some point, a parent makes the decision. My child has to make the mistake for him to learn from it. They have to fall, and then once they have fallen and they realize their error, now I can pick them up. And this is a very similar way in which God responds to us. We see this in the words of Amir al-Mu'mineen. Ha inna ha huna la ilman jamma. The Imam says, in here, and the hadith specifies, it says that the Imam points to his chest. There is a great and a vast knowledge herein. لو أصبت له حملا. If only I were to find someone who could carry that knowledge. بلى أصبت لبنا غير مأمون. Yes, I found people who think they can carry it and who pick it up very quickly, but they don't preserve it. They use it for their own worldly gain. What is our disposition and what is our response to knowledge? Do I cut myself off? Or do I engage and try to learn before I give my opinion? Now, this is many hundreds of years ago. Even today, we have something very similar. Just a few years ago, in the country of Iraq, there was a very difficult political and social situation. And after years, when the ulama of Iraq had told one person after another, had tried to guide the people of Iraq and the leaders and the authorities of Iraq, it got to a point when even, this is the actions of Sayyid Sistani, Ayatollah Sistani, he says that he even stops the Salatul Jum'ah when he sees that there's no effect. Whatever guidance and teaching is given, nothing changes. And so the response in those instances sometimes is not to yell or to scream, to try to find ways of displaying that guidance. Sometimes the response is simply silence. Whether it is in our own personal lives, in our own families, or even on a larger social or political stage. So we have to open ourselves up to learn and to be guided by the words and the teachings of Amir al-Mu'mineen. In this night, we are dedicating ourselves to commemorating the death and the martyrdom of Amir al-Mu'mineen. Let's open ourselves up and try to learn from the words of Amir al-Mu'mineen. We gather in these places, and sometimes we think that only benefit of these occasions, the only benefit of these majalis is that I learn something. But that is not the teaching of Islam. The teaching of Islam tells us that we have to become a different person. We learn so that that learning can transform us. Our eyes and ears are vessels and means for that hidayah to reach our hearts. And so we come into these majalis despite all of the difficulties of these gatherings, despite all of the distances that we have to travel, because we know that first of all, any majlis in which the hadith of Amir al-Mu'mineen and the Ahlul Bayt is recited is a majlis that has been blessed by Allah Himself. It is said that the angels of Allah descend into those majalis. Sometimes we think that it's only about learning, but that's not what these majalis are all about. Yes, learning is a very important component, and we have to open ourselves up to that learning. But these majalis are places in which the angels of Allah descend. In various ahadith, we are told that the angels come down, and then they spread their wings underneath the mu'mineen and the mu'minat that are gathered in that place. So we come into these majalis physically and spiritually to gain some of those blessings, because the words and the memory of Amir al-Mu'mineen is being renewed. Amir al-Mu'mineen, sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Amir al-Mu'mineen is the center of our identity as a Shia. But it's not just for us Shia. In fact, we have ahadith that state that Amir al-Mu'mineen is the means by which, the criteria that any Muslim can use to determine whether they have faith and iman or whether they have kufr and disbelief. There was a very famous incident in the life of Amir al-Mu'mineen, incident of the Shura, the gathering and the council that was determined to set the to the second Khalifa. And after all of the companions of the Prophet, those who were gathered in that meeting, it is said that after all of them had spoken, Amir al-Mu'mineen, he said, now it is my turn to speak. In this report, Amir al-Mu'mineen, this is mentioned in the Amali of Shaykh al-Tusi. It is said that Amir al-Mu'mineen says, now I want to say a few things. And Amir al-Mu'mineen begins with a long hadith. I will just mention a few sentences from that hadith. He says, you all are debating who is going to be the successor to Rasulullah. But I want to ask each and every one of you, is there any amongst you who has these characteristics that Rasulullah himself mentions? فَهَلْ فِيكُمْ أَحَدٌ قَالَ لَهُ رَسُولُ اللَّهِ إِنَّهُ لَا يُحِبُّكَ إِلَّا مُؤْمِنٌ وَلَا يُبْغِضُكَ إِلَّا كَافِرٌ غَيْرِ. Is there anyone amongst you about whom Rasulullah said that anyone who loves you is a mu'min, and anyone who despises you is a kafir, except for me? What does this mean? If I want to know whether I am a mu'min, I have to see what is the relationship of Amir al-Mu'mineen in my heart. Where does Amir al-Mu'mineen stand in my heart? Do I love him? Do I like to hear about the life and the ahadith of Amir al-Mu'mineen? Or do I think that somehow I have graduated from that part of my life? Somehow that I've heard so many of the stories of Amir al-Mu'mineen and now I don't really need to hear about them anymore. Is that the state of Amir al-Mu'mineen in my heart? Or do I love to hear the name of Amir al-Mu'mineen? Whenever I hear his name, Ali ibn Abi Talib, tears start to well up in my eyes. What is the state of Amir al-Mu'mineen in my heart? The Imam continues, فَهَلْ فِيكُمْ أَحَدٌ صَلَّى مَعَ رَسُولِ اللَّهِ قَبْلَ النَّاسِ سَبْعًا وَسِتِّينَ شَهْرًا غَيْرِي. This is a very beautiful part of the hadith. The Imam says, is there any amongst you who prayed with the Prophet of Islam in those most difficult of times when the Prophet began his message for 67 months, for 6 years and 7 months, other than me? Is there anyone amongst you who sacrificed himself in the face of all of the enemies that the Prophet had other than me? This is where I want to focus on. This next line, the Imam says, فَهَلْ فِيكُمْ أَحَدٌ قَالَ لَهُ رَسُولُ اللَّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَآلِهِ أَنْتَ أَقْوَمُ. We want to know why we love Amir al-Mu'mineen. We have all of these reports, these fada'il that we have heard time and time again, and we must remind ourselves and teach our children about these fada'il. These are not just throwaway lines. These are lines that instill that love of Amir al-Mu'mineen in our hearts and in the hearts of our families. But sometimes we want to go a little bit further. We want to know why did Rasulullah distinguish Amir al-Mu'mineen from everyone else. In this one segment, Amir al-Mu'mineen explains this. فَهَلْ فِيكُمْ أَحَدٌ قَالَ لَهُ رَسُولُ اللَّهِ أَنْتَ أَقْوَمُهُمْ بِأَمْرِ اللَّهِ Ya Amir al-Mu'mineen, you are the one who is the sturdiest and the one who establishes the command and the affair of Allah. وَأَوْفَاهُمْ بِعَهْدِ اللَّهِ, and you uphold and you fulfill that covenant that Allah has placed. You are the most trustworthy and loyal to that commitment. وَأَعْلَمُهُمْ بِالْقَضِيَّةِ, and you are the most knowledgeable about this issue. وَأَقْسَمُهُمْ بِالسَّوِيَّةِ, and you judge in the most equitable manner. وَأَرْأَفُهُمْ بِالرَّعِيَّةِ, and yet, despite all of that, despite your knowledge, despite your justice, and despite all of the other characteristics that Amir al-Mu'mineen had, you are also the most loving to the people. Talk about those conflicting and contradicting characteristics that you can only find in a person like Amir al-Mu'mineen. On the one hand, he is the most just. On the other hand, he is the most loving. This is, again, a very complicated and a very intricate hadith. I just want to mention a few of these points. Rasulullah, according to this one report, he said, أَنْتَ أَقْوَمُهُمْ بِأَمْرِ اللَّهِ. You establish the command of Allah, you're the most principled in establishing the command of Allah. When we look through the life of Amir al-Mu'mineen, in particular, in the Khilafat of Amir al-Mu'mineen, we see that Imam Ali faced one civil war after another, one conflict after another. In fact, if you look at the life and the Khilafat of Amir al-Mu'mineen, there wasn't a year in which Amir al-Mu'mineen and his army was not faced with a battle. And yet, after all of that sacrifice, after all of that bloodshed, the response of the Muslims was to give the reins of authority to a person like Muawiyah. And Muawiyah establishes a tradition amongst the Muslims that now the Muslims come and curse Amir al-Mu'mineen, not just for, sometimes we think it's just for 100 years. It's actually longer than that. But in this one hadith, this one report from Ibn Abbas, that's a very famous companion of the Prophet, it is said that Ibn Abbas was sitting with Muawiyah in Di al-Quwa. It's a big valley right outside of the city of Mecca. And it is said that Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, the commander of the army of the Muslims, who went and conquered Persia, not just a regular lay person, very important commander of the army, very important, prestigious companion of the Prophet. It is said that Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas comes into this company of Muawiyah and some of the people of Sham, of Damascus and Syria. And it is said that Muawiyah responds to Sa'd's presence. He says, Ya Ahl Sham, O people of Syria and Damascus, this is Sa'd. He is a Sadiqul Ali. He is a friend of Ali. And then the people of Sham, they shake their heads and they laugh and they start to curse Amir al-Mu'mineen. And Sa'd, he begins to cry. Muawiyah responds, he says, Oh Sa'd, why do you cry? Then Sa'd begins to say, he says, I cry because I hear one of the greatest, if not the greatest companion. Sa'd wasn't known to be one of the Shia of Amir al-Mu'mineen, but he knew the virtues of Amir al-Mu'mineen. He says, I cry because I hear one of the greatest companions of Rasulullah, one of the greatest people who sacrificed himself for Islam, being cursed now in the presence of what is considered to be the Khalifatul Muslimin. And I can't do anything to change your attitude towards Ali. I know there are 5 things that if I had those things, if I had those characteristics, then those characteristics would outweigh anything else that I could have in this world. And Sa'd begins to describe these 5 things. I just want to focus on one of those things. One of those characteristics, those virtues of Amir al-Mu'mineen. al-Mu'mineen. It is said, Sa'd recounts, he says that on the day of Khaybar, when Rasulullah had sent the other Muslims, the great companions, those who were sort of very known for their chivalry and their courage and their bravery, he sent them to the fort of Khaybar. He gave them the flag and had given them the command of the army. Each one of these companions would go forward and then they would scurry away. They would run away from the battle. Until the point came in which Rasulullah said that I am going to give this flag to a person that يُحِبُّ اللَّهَ وَرَسُولَهُ وَيُحِبُّهُ اللَّهُ وَرَسُولَهُ. A person who loves Allah and His Prophet, and Allah and His Prophet in turn love him. Then Amirul Mu'mineen enters the majlis. Amirul Mu'mineen had a pain and a disease in his eye. The Prophet himself, he goes and cures the eye of Amirul Mu'mineen. And then he gives him that flag and that command. And he goes and conquers the fort of Khaybar that was impenetrable for the Muslims. We want to think about a person who establishes Amrullah, a person who does not fear any battle. And yet, is also the person who is the most knowledgeable. Again, that same Ibn Abbas. He says there is a person who comes from the people of Sham. In this same report, Ibn Abbas is asked, what are some of these, who is the most knowledgeable amongst the companions? Ibn Abbas says, is there anyone else other than Amirul Mu'mineen? And he begins to describe. He says, Amirul Mu'mineen received his knowledge from Rasulullah. Rasulullah himself taught Amirul Mu'mineen. Allah teaches Rasulullah. So there's this chain. Allah teaches Rasulullah, and then Rasulullah teaches Amirul Mu'mineen. And he says, Ibn Abbas says, whatever knowledge you think that I have, I receive all of this knowledge from Amirul Mu'mineen himself. Abbas says, علم أصحاب محمد كلهم في علم علي كالقطرة الواحدة في سبعة أبحر. The knowledge of Amirul Mu'mineen compared to any of the other ashab of Rasulullah is like a single drop in the face of the 7 seas. Think about how small a single drop is and think about how large the ocean is. This is the knowledge of Amirul Mu'mineen, the bravery and the courage of Amirul Mu'mineen. Now think about the justice of Amirul Mu'mineen. When all of those Khawarij come and attack the Muslims and they shed the blood of the Muslims, and Amirul Mu'mineen himself knows what his ultimate fate is going to be. He's going to be killed by one of these very Khawarij. Amirul Mu'mineen, it is said, when the Muslims begin after this battle in which the Khawarij now come and fight with the Muslims, after these civil wars that are engaged in during the time of Amirul Mu'mineen, it is said that all of the other Muslims now, later on, when we want to figure out what do we do when Muslim fights Muslim, when Mu'min fights Mu'min, when you have a civil war, what is the fiqh of this civil war? How do you have vengeance against another Muslim? Do you go and kill that Muslim? Or do you spare his life? It is said that the fuqaha of the Muslims, not just of the school of the Ahlul Bayt, they all look to the actions and the response of Amirul Mu'mineen against the Khawarij. So if you want to know what true forgiveness and mercy is, you look to the behavior of Amirul Mu'mineen against the Khawarij. What did Amirul Mu'mineen do? It is said that when Amirul Mu'mineen, when Imam Ali he was able to destroy and to defeat the army of the Khawarij, he didn't go and seek vengeance against these Muslims. He said, forgive them. And if they come back towards righteousness and truth, if they give up this rebellion, then even the property that you have taken from them, you have to give back. So you're not just sparing their life, you're not just sparing their families, you're even sparing the property of these Muslims, because the property of a Muslim is sacred. After the strike that Ibn Muljam hit Amir al-Mu'mineen with, Amir al-Mu'mineen says, after I am gone, don't fight, says this to those who succeeded. He says, don't fight these Khawarij, because that is not what true justice requires. We fight them until they give up their cause and they give up this rebellion. So we want to think about the justice of Amir al-Mu'mineen and the compassion that he showed towards even his own enemies. We want to think about now, turn our attention towards the household of Amir al-Mu'mineen. This is the final night in which Amir al-Mu'mineen is surrounded by his children. We said last night, in this final night, all of the companions of Amir al-Mu'mineen are beginning to surround him. They're saying his final farewell. Their final farewell to their Mawla, to Imam Ali. One after another, the orphans come. And it is said that in those final moments, it is only the Ahlul Bayt and the children of Imam Ali were surrounding his bed. These children who had seen the demise of their mother, Lady Fatima al-Zahra. They had to suffer the death of Rasulullah himself. And now it is time for the farewell to their father, Amir al-Mu'mineen, Ali ibn Abi Talib. What does Amir al-Mu'mineen say to Imam Hassan? What is he saying to Lady Zainab? It is said that when Amir al-Mu'mineen looks to Imam Hussein, he says, oh Hussein, wait and have patience, because you are going to see a trial that no one before you has seen. It is said that it was a tradition and a custom. What the reason for this custom is, we must contemplate ourselves. But it was a tradition and a custom amongst the Ahlul Bayt that the bodies of the Ahlul Bayt would be shrouded and would be buried at night. And their burial places would be covered and would be hidden from the sights and from the knowledge of the Muslims. It is said that even the grave of Amir al-Mu'mineen was not known to the Muslims for generations to come. Because Amir al-Mu'mineen knew that if the Khawarij and if his enemies found out where his grave was, they would not even spare the body of Amir al-Mu'mineen. And so it is said that Imam Zayn al-Abidin, he comes and recites the ziyarat Amin Allah, this very famous ziyarat of Amin Allah in silence and in the darkness of the night. Assalamu alaykum ya Amin Allah fi khalqi. Assalamu alaykum ya Amin Allah fi ardi wa hujjatahu ala ibadi. It is said that in that final night, Amir al-Mu'mineen's body is surrounded by his children. And then finally, when Amir al-Mu'mineen gives his final breath, he says this ayah of the Quran, Inna Allaha ma'al-ladheena taqaw wal-ladheena hum muhsinun. And Amir al-Mu'mineen's soul departs from his body. And yet it is said that Imam Hassan and Imam Hussein, the children of Amir al-Mu'mineen and his closest companions, they come and now they wash the body of Imam Ali. And they shroud the body of Imam Ali. And it is said that the children of Imam Ali, they lift that body and from the back, and it is the angels who carry that body upon their shoulders from the front. And they guide the body towards its final resting place. It is said, and we can only imagine what must be going through the hearts of Imam Hassan and Imam Hussein. We can only imagine what Imam Hassan, when he places the body within that grave, what must be going through the heart, how Imam Hassan must be shedding those tears of grief and of sadness of having lost his father. Of Imam Hussein as he places the body in the grave. But it is at this time that we can only think of Imam Hussein. Amir al-Mu'mineen says, you are going to face a trial and a difficulty, Ya Hussein, so have patience. Oh Zainab, you are going to be with my Hussein, so have patience. Oh Abbas, you better not leave the side of your brother until you have given your life. Oh Abbas, have patience. Think about those final moments. Imam Zayn al-Abidin, how could he bear to place the body of his father in that grave when his head was removed from his body, when his body was left without a shroud on the desert ground, when his body was pierced with arrow and with sword, cut to pieces? How could Imam Zayn al-Abidin now, after 40 years, after this time, how can Imam Zayn al-Abidin now face that difficult moment? And so, at the same time that we shed tears for Amir al-Mu'mineen, we shed tears for Imam Hussein. We shed tears for Lady Zainab, and we say, Lady Zainab, have patience. You are going to face a difficulty for you. وَسَيَعْمَلُ الَّذِينَ ظَلَمُوا أَيَّ مُنْقَلَبٍ يَنقَلِبُونَ إِنَّا لِلَّهِ